Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gachurio Wash Process Kenya from Kafferaven. There's the container right there. And Kafferaven, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is part 2 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and the third time Kafferaven has appeared on this channel, as it looks like they were absent from last year's KaffeBox Advent Calendar, but did appear in our first ever Advent Calendar series back in 2020. And I do always find it interesting anytime a coffee roaster opts for one of their Kenyan coffees, as a lot of people know that Kenyan coffees aren't necessarily my favorite, even though we do end up reviewing a lot of those coffees, mostly due to the fact that if a coffee roaster can impress me with their Kenyan coffee, then they've definitely caught my interest. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out. And going over the way that this works one more time. So all of our notes and tasting wheel are done with the V60, and this cup right here, the second cup, is brewed with the Chemex. And we stuck to the standard recipe for this one, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, 96 degrees Celsius. And roast profile for this coffee, definitely very much in line again with the Nordic Light roast profile. It's not necessarily an uber light, so it's not one of those super light cups of coffee, but definitely still on the lighter side in general. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression, and the cup was very bright right at the forefront, so very traditional Kenyan in that sense. Honestly, this coffee sounded very much like a traditional Kenyan right from the onset, and it emitted a lot of classic Kenyan characteristics, leaning quite heavily into the berry fruit as well as the savory characteristics. This one definitely skewed a little heavy on the savory side, more so in the V60 than in the Chemex, as this feels like a slightly more clean cup of coffee. I'm getting a little less of the savory kind of tomato-like aspects through this brew method. A fair bit of the herbal florality, which is fitting for the listed hibiscus. And once I saw hibiscus listed as a flavor note on that coffee, I'm like, okay, I have a pretty good idea of what we might be expecting with this one, as there is a citric component to it as well. I mean, it's very much in line with what you were expecting and what they listed on this coffee. There's some additional slight bit of smokiness to contrast the really high acidity and brightness, but for the most part, this was a very vintage Kenyan cup of coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and for level 4, so let's go through those real quick. We will start with the savoriness at a level 4. So yes, this one had a lot of those savory characteristics to it, as I oftentimes describe, very Kenyan-like savoriness to the cup. Again, this actually comes out a little bit more candied on this brew method through the V60. So a little bit more clarity, a little bit more sweetness in general, and a little less of the savory aspects. So tasting wheel, at least in terms of the savoriness, looks a little different based off of the brew method. Finish, level 4. I always say I don't think I've ever seen a Kenyan coffee not reach minimum level 4 in terms of the finish. This one has a fair bit of that lasting Kenyan finish with a high bit of the acidity, which goes in line with the acidity being at that level 4. Yes, very classic vintage Kenyan-like acidity, that kind of really bright tart berry acidity to it, which is why the berry fruit also finishes at that level 4 mark. Those are kind of trademarks for what you might expect from a classic Kenyan, all kind of hitting those level 4 marks. But that's why the level 3s matter so much. So let's run through those real quick. Body, level 3, yes, again, kind of that classic Kenyan juicy-like body, as it definitely has a little bit more than the previous cup, just kind of a little bit more thicker bodied in general. Through the Chemex, it still has a fair bit of that body as well, so it's not something I would adjust based off of brew method even. Cleanliness, level 3, again, pretty typical for Kenyan coffees, as oftentimes I can feel that the flavor profile is a little murky based off of the fact that it can come off a little bit more savory than anything else. So level 3, about right for me in this coffee. Sweetness, level 3, yes, that feels about perfect, because a lot of the other characteristics, most distinctly the savoriness, really does seem to dominate the cup. And as a result, I oftentimes have a bit of difficulty pushing that above the level 3 mark. As mentioned, it's a little sweeter through the Chemex, so I could maybe justify the higher side of level 3, but even then, it's kind of a little bit even on that level 3 mark. Florality, level 3, it could be on the higher side, honestly. The somewhat herbal hibiscus-like component to this coffee is quite strong as well. Maybe not to the same extent as the bright berry acidity that's from this coffee, but I think if I was being a little generous, I could bump that all the way up to the level 5 mark, but correction, level 4 mark, but I don't know if I necessarily feel it's to equal measure as the kind of savory as well as berry components to the cup. Citrus fruit, level 3, definitely the second most pronounced characteristic in terms of fruit profiles for this coffee, as it is pretty bright and that seems to go in line with the acidity as well. So I like it there at that level 3 mark. Not much of a change through the Chemex, although it maybe is a little bit more even to the berry fruit, which isn't quite as heavy in the Chemex. It actually comes out a little bit more candied and sweet in general. So tasting wheel looks, again, kind of different based off of the brew method, but I think that this is a pretty nice representation of the coffee in general. I think this is kind of the best way you'd expect to get this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It was a very Kenyan-like cup of coffee, and the reason I don't necessarily like Kenyan coffees is because of the savory aspects that you can experience from them. And I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of acidity either, so this one had a lot of the classic Kenyan characteristics that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. I liked it a lot more through the Chemex, and if I had more of this coffee, I'd probably experiment with it a lot more through the Chemex, because I feel like there's some hidden sweetness that you can definitely get from this coffee, and toning down some of the other aspects to it, most distinctly that savoriness, and raising the clarity ever so slightly is why I really preferred this brew method for this coffee. And I see potential in it, but it just never felt like it was ever my type of Kenyan coffee, which does kind of lead into the person I would suggest this coffee for, and it makes for a very easy and straightforward recommendation. People that very much like their traditional Kenyan coffees, because this had all of those characteristics to it. The savoriness, the brightness, the berry components, and they are all in abundance and you can feel them, and every part of this coffee just tastes like a very expected Kenyan coffee. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gachurio Wash Process Kenya from Kafferaven. Thank you for watching.